Everybody today? First off, I just want to thank Effort and Maria for organizing the session, and for all my grad students. Eric Paulo is the one who really kind of put this together. I'm just presenting today. She'll be available for questions at the end. And Jason Breyer, who is the PI of the grant, he's a great collaborator. So he made that all possible for this study. So my job today, I'm going to present the results of a study where we examine SRL profiles among online college learners. This was a very small part of a larger RCT trying to examine the effectiveness of DAX, which I'll explain a little bit later, in terms of the achievement and motivation of college students. And so prior to the study, I'm going to give you a brief overview of SRL, online learning, and person-centered approaches. And then if I have time, talk about implications and areas for future research. So SRL, what is it? Well, it's a process. It's a goal-directed process where people strategically, metacognitively, motivationally engage in learning with the hope of achieving something, accomplishing a goal. And there's many models and theories about this process, but most folks think about three dimensions of SRL: motivation, metacognition, and strategic action. And it's how these three dimensions intersect that explain how people regulate. Now, SRL is a very relevant and important topic in many contexts and fields. K-12, reading, math, writing, studying, medical education, clinical settings, therapeutic environments, sports. SRL has been applied. It's recognized as a critical 21st century skill for a reason. It is absolutely an essential skill for kids to develop. Now, one context that has garnered much attention amongst SRL researchers is computer-based learning and online courses, online degrees, and we know there's been an explosion of interest in this area in online learning at the college level and the high school level. There's increasing course offerings and degree programs. And so when we talk about online degree programs, there's a natural link between online contexts and the need for SRL skills. Students have much more autonomy, they're independent, less social supports, less social interaction, which could have a negative effect on students. They often have to problem solve, deal with confusion in different ways. And so SRL really is a needed skill, particularly in this context. Concurrent with this trend is this notion of person-centered approaches to studying SRL. So rather than simply looking at if X causes Y, or X relates to Y, or a set of variables predicts Y, person-centered approaches looks more at the patterns of SRL skills within individuals, and then to identify if there are groups of these people exhibiting the same patterns. And so this is consistent, in my perspective, with intervention research, where we're interested in examining and targeting multiple SRL and motivational processes at the same time and as they intersect. That's a critical thing. But there is variation in the scope and the nature of these types of studies. Some are very narrow, that they just look at motivation variables in established profiles. Some look at one or two dimensions of SRL. Some look at all three, but they don't really do a comprehensive job of really representing that dimension. Most of the studies have also targeted students from traditional classrooms, and so very few have examined SRL profiles for those in online contexts. So the purpose of this study, we wanted to identify and validate SRL profiles or clusters of students in an online college, and we wanted to look at differences that might emerge across a variety of academic success indicators. So we had a very large sample that we selected from an online college. And again, this data was collected from this broader RCT initiative. I think the best thing to do is kind of show you a diagram of DAX, which is the Diagnostic Assessment and Achievement of College Skills. And what this is when students enroll in college, they get a variety of assessments. We assess their SRL skills, their math, reading, and writing. Students get feedback about this. They also get access and prompts to use a variety of open educational resources. And then advisors play a key role here. There's an advisor dashboard which summarizes the results and provides clues and hints about how they could interact with students in a meaningful way during advising sessions. And again, this is in an online context. We've also been exploring ways of using this data to improve the predictive modeling. So where are we in this study? We're right here. in DAX. We're looking at this SRL survey, how the survey is used to form these clusters. We're also going to look at differences amongst the clusters across these academic skills and other outcomes as well. So in terms of the SRL measure, there were 3 dimensions and there were multiple subscales for each dimension. And so we were really trying to comprehensively target each of these 3 dimensions. So there was a minimum of 3 subscales. And they all had strong internal consistency at the composite level. In terms of the academic success variables that we were interested in, there were 3, reading, math, writing. We were interested in credits earned versus attempted, as well as the views that they had for the online resource, like how often, how frequently did they actually access the feedback and the material that they had in front of them, that was provided to them. So 3 really broad research questions. First 2 pertaining to the number of clusters that we could identify as most meaningful and interpretable, and the nature of those clusters. And then can we validate that cluster solution across a separate sample? So we divided the large sample into 2. We ran k-means cluster analysis for 3, 4, 5, and 6 clusters, given that research has shown variation in the number of clusters that one might expect when running this type of analysis. And then obviously, like I said, we looked at differences across these clusters. So the main result was that the 4-factor solution emerged as most interpretable. And this was identical across samples, which was great to see. And we identified 2 clusters of the clusters, in a sense. So we had 2 consistent clusters. The high SRL group, they were high across the board, across all dimensions. The moderate SRL group was kind of middle of the road, maybe a little higher than the midpoint. And then we had 2 variable clusters, and these were characterized by lower metacognition scores. And so we had a moderate-high strategic motivation group with lower metacognition, and a low strategic motivation with very low metacognition relative to the other groups. Might make sense if I show you a diagram, which could help. So the 2 blue ones represent the consistent groups, and the 2 green lines represent the variable groups. And you can see the difference between them is just really the level of how high it was across these dimensions. Now, I do want to point out that of the 2 groups that show the highest motivation was the high SRL group and the moderate-high low metacognition group. And I'm going to talk about that, and that has some implication maybe to help us understand a little bit about some of the differences we did observe. In terms of those differences, we did find that the high SRL group and the moderate-high strategic motivation group were superior across most of the measures when you compare them to 3 and 4. All right. So what I'm talking about here is basically that group, the high consistent group, and the other group, which was fairly high, close to that group for motivation, but not for metacognition, which was much lower. All right. In terms of differences across credits attempted and credits earned, the same pattern was observed across these variables. The one interesting one was the use of online resources, and we found that the moderate-high strategic motivation group, low metacognition, it's a mouthful, they had more, they accessed the resources more than the high group consistent and the moderate consistent group. And it seems that doesn't make sense, but in reflection, maybe it does. The students who were the moderate high, they had higher motivation. They wanted to perform well. They had that those adaptive motivation beliefs. But when they got feedback, it said, "Oh, you're low here." So it prompted them to access the material. Where the other group, the high group, the moderate group, they said, "Oh, I'm fine," likely, and didn't pursue that. So they kind of ignored it in a sense. So in general, I have a couple minutes. Mm-hmm. I'm good?
Yep,
all right.
4 minutes actually.
Perfect. So my final conclusion is basically we felt that we expanded the literature a bit regarding examining SRL profiles. We validated a 4-factor solution across 2 large samples, which was nice. We used a comprehensive assessment of composites and used those composites to establish these profiles. And we were looking in an online context, which there was a gap of research. More substantively, the patterns that we found were very similar across other cluster solutions in the literature for college students. And what you tend to find are consistently high group, a consistently average group. Sometimes you get a consistently low group, not always, but a lot of times you do. And then you get the mixed bag, where you have these unique patterns of individuals that really are the interesting ones. And I have to acknowledge at the outset that the effects that we got across the achievement limits were tiny. They were very, very small. We had a large sample size, so we got statistical differences, but it was very small. And it is what it is at this point, and there's nothing we can do about that. But the findings were in expected directions. That is, the low cluster was consistently the lowest and weaker across these outcomes than the other groups. The two clusters that had the highest level of motivation performed the best, regardless of their level of metacognition, which was interesting. And there was no difference between the lowest group and the consistent moderate group. They functioned the same in terms of those academic skill indicators. So my final slide, just to talk about some broad conclusions. And I have to say at the outset, I'm not a big profile cluster guy. This was a stretch for me to think about this way because I'm wary about aptitude by treatment mindsets. That is, if you develop a profile or a diagnosis of somebody, they should get that intervention. That's not really how it works, and it really wasn't my intention to do it that way. It was more about how do we develop and think about profiles and validate that and look at their meaningful differences, but can we use that information in such a way where advisors, practitioners, educators can help them interact and say meaningful things to students and direct that conversation to explore what they might need to improve and work on. So for me, it's about that level of interaction that I'm hopeful that we could explore this in greater depth over time and have a better understanding of what is possible to make that happen. Thank you.